The Inner Voice That Persuades by Alexander Cain. Published by Audiobooks Hub. Introduction. There's a voice inside your head that never shuts up. It comments, judges, questions, comforts, doubts, encourages, and sometimes even lies. It's with you in the quietest moments, when you're brushing your teeth or walking down the street, when you can't sleep at 3 a.m., or right before you step into something new and uncertain. That voice, your inner voice, can be your greatest ally or your most subtle saboteur. But what if I told you that this voice is also your most powerful tool of persuasion? Not persuasion in the way we typically understand it, convincing others with flashy arguments or dramatic speeches. I mean real persuasion, the kind that begins and ends with yourself, the quiet, nearly invisible influence that determines how you act, what you believe, and whether or not you become who you're meant to be. It's the voice that shapes your decisions long before you speak a word out loud. Most people never really stop to question this inner dialogue. It plays in the background like white noise. But the truth is, this internal monologue has more impact on your life than any external factor. It determines how you show up in the world. If you listen closely, you'll realize that many of your external successes and failures were first rehearsed in the theater of your mind. This book is about making that voice conscious, about learning to hear it clearly, to train it, to refine it, and most importantly, to use it, not to manipulate others, but to align yourself, to find clarity, to command your own thoughts and direction. So when you do speak to the world, people listen, not because you've tricked them, but because you become the kind of person who speaks with quiet, magnetic conviction. We've been taught to focus on external communication, how to speak, how to write, how to pitch. But inner persuasion is the foundation of all of that. It's the hidden source of confidence, charisma, discipline, and even creativity. When your inner voice becomes coherent, powerful, and supportive, everything outside begins to shift. You start making decisions faster. You stop hesitating in the face of opportunity. You handle criticism better. You become calm in chaos and firm under pressure. In the pages that follow, we'll explore how this inner voice is formed, how it persuades and deceives, and how to take control of it. We'll uncover why some people seem so sure of themselves, and why others can't stop second-guessing. We'll walk through stories, scientific insights, and practical tools that will help you reshape that constant voice in your head into something more accurate, more powerful, and more yours. This isn't a book about tricking your brain into blind positivity. It's about clarity, about learning to speak to yourself in a way that's honest, focused, and fiercely constructive. Because when you change how you talk to yourself, you change everything. There's a secret hidden in your thoughts, and it's been there the whole time. Your inner voice isn't just a commentator, it's a creator. And the way it persuades you will become the way you persuade the world. Chapter 1. It begins earlier than we think. Before we learn to speak, before we understand the meaning of words, the voice inside us begins to form. At first, it's a collection of echoes, parents' tones, teachers' corrections, praises, scoldings, the laughter of peers, the silence after mistakes. Our inner voice starts not as our own, but as a collage of what others said about us, to us, and sometimes what they never said but we imagined anyway. By the time we reach adulthood, we assume this voice is truly ours, but it isn't. Not yet. It's an inherited script, stitched together from memory and emotion, from culture and conditioning. And the scary part is, we believe it. When you hear, "You're not good at that," or "You always mess things up," or "Don't get your hopes up," you rarely stop to question the source. You just assume it's you being realistic. But if you trace the origin of that voice, it's almost always borrowed. A remark from childhood, a cruel joke from someone you once admired, a moment of embarrassment that replayed itself until it became a law. The first step in harnessing your inner voice is recognizing that it's not the truth. It's a story, and stories can be edited. One of the most dangerous things about the inner voice is how subtle it can be. It rarely yells. It whispers. It makes suggestions, plants doubts, raises questions. Are you sure? Maybe later. That won't work. You're not ready. They'll laugh. Don't try too hard. Don't risk too much. It sounds protective, even reasonable. But over time, it becomes a leash tied to a stake in the ground you forgot was ever there. Let's be honest. You probably talked yourself out of more opportunities than anyone else ever has. You had the idea. You felt the spark. Then the voice stepped in. What if it fails? Who do you think you are? People like you don't do things like that. And you listened, not because it was true, but because it was familiar. The key word here is familiar. The brain, fascinatingly enough, tend to prefer familiarity over accuracy. If a thought has been repeated enough times, your mind will register it as safe, even if it's toxic. That's why breaking out of old mental patterns can feel uncomfortable, even when those patterns are obviously holding you back. You're not resisting the new idea because it's wrong. You're resisting it because it's unfamiliar. So how do we begin changing the inner voice? We start by noticing it, paying attention, not trying to fix it instantly, but becoming an observer. Think of it like standing outside a house and listening through a window to what's being said inside. What do you hear? Are the words kind? Are they demanding? Do they push you forward or pull you down? You might be surprised by how often your inner voice talks to you like an impatient boss or a worried parent or a sarcastic critic. And once you notice it, ask yourself a simple but powerful question. Would I speak to someone I love the way I'm speaking to myself right now? If the answer is no, something needs to change. Awareness doesn't fix everything, but it opens a door. Once you can hear the voice clearly, you can begin to rewrite it, not with lies or fake confidence, but with better stories, more accurate, empowering, and useful ones. For example, instead of, I always mess this up, you can learn, say, I've struggled with this before, but I'm learning. It's not about pretending everything is perfect. It's about persuading yourself with truth that builds you, not truth that breaks you. You see, persuasion isn't just about getting someone to say yes. It's about helping someone believe something useful. And when it comes to your inner voice, you are that someone. The best persuaders in history, leaders, innovators, storytellers, all had one thing in common. Their inner voice didn't constantly sabotage them. It questioned them. Yes, it challenged them, but it didn't stop them. It didn't freeze them with fear. It didn't convince them they were small. What most people call confidence is often just a well-trained inner voice, one that says, I've got this, instead of, I'm doomed. One that asks, what can I learn, instead of, why do I suck? It's not louder, it's just more useful. Training your inner voice takes time, but it starts today with the next thought you notice, the next assumption you challenge, the next moment you stop and ask, is this voice helping me or hurting me? Most of the time, you don't need more external advice. You don't need another book or podcast or expert telling you what to do. You already know. Deep down, you know what matters to you, what excites you, what scares you. What you need is your own voice to start supporting that knowledge instead of burying it under fear. When your inner voice aligns with your deeper truth, you don't need motivation tricks. You move, you act, you speak, because there's no longer a civil war between what you want and what you allow yourself to believe. And that's the beginning of real persuasion, the inner kind. Chapter 2. There's a strange kind of silence that lives in the mind just before a decision. It's not true silence, more like a pause in the noise, where something within you is weighing options, judging outcomes, feeling the future before it happens. And in that moment, your inner voice leans in. It doesn't always give you a clear answer, but it always says something. That tiny voice might say, "Go for it," or "Wait," or "Don't be stupid." And whatever it says, it carries weight because it's your voice, or at least it feels like it is. But here's the catch. We don't often stop to question whether that voice is actually wise or just loud. Not all inner voices are created equal. Some people live with an inner critic who never tires, who turns every idea into a liability and every mistake into a moral failure. Others carry the voice of a drill sergeant, pushing them to do more, achieve more, never rest. And a lucky few have cultivated an inner guide, firm, calm, insightful, a voice that helps them think clearly, not just emotionally. Most of us fluctuate. On some days, our inner voice lifts us. On others, it traps us. The goal of this chapter is to start identifying what kind of voice dominates your decisions and whether it's helping you become who you want to be. To begin, let's break down the 3 most common types of inner voices. The critic. This one is sharp, fast, and unforgiving. It thrives on perfectionism. When something goes wrong, it says, "Of course you messed up. That's just like you." It keeps you small by making you afraid of mistakes. It calls this realism. But in truth, it confuses self-awareness with self-punishment. The commander. This voice is about control. It's obsessed with productivity, discipline, outcomes. It rewards performance and punishes rest. On the surface, it can look like drive or ambition, but often leaves you burnout, detached, and feeling like you're never enough, even when you succeed. The guide. This voice is rarer but possible to build. It's thoughtful, grounded, encouraging. It sees your flaws, but doesn't weaponize them. It asks better questions. It helps you reflect instead of react. It doesn't scream. It invites. It persuades not with pressure, but with presence. You probably hear a mix of these voices at different times. But ask yourself, which one leads when things go wrong? When you fail, when you hesitate, when you're tired? Who takes over? The power of persuasion, both internal and external, is deeply affected by which voice is in charge. If the critic or commander dominates, your actions will often come from fear, of judgment, of failure, of being left behind. But if the guide takes the lead, your decisions begin to emerge from clarity, alignment, and strength. Let's take an example. You're offered an opportunity, a big one. It's exciting, but also intimidating. Maybe a new role, a chance to speak publicly, or even just starting something that's meaningful to you. If the critic speaks first, it might say, "You'll embarrass yourself. You're not ready. Someone else could do this better." If the commander jumps in, it might say, "You better say yes and deliver perfectly. There's no room to screw this up." But if the guide steps forward, it might say, "This is new, and it's okay to feel unsure. What do you need to feel more prepared? Do you want this for the right reasons? Let's grow into this together." Do you see the difference? It's not just about the message. It's the tone, the intention, the effect. The inner voice that persuades best is the one that keeps you moving, not the one that corners you with fear or drags you with guilt. So, how do you invite the guide to speak louder? Start by changing the questions you ask yourself. Bad inner voices ask bad questions. What if I fail? Why do I always do this? What's wrong with me? Good inner voices ask better ones. What can I learn? What matters most right now? How can I grow through this? Questions shape the tone of your inner dialogue. They shift the brain's focus. Your mind loves answering questions. It will dig for answers whether the question helps you or hurts you. So ask better ones. Another tool is naming the voices. Literally, when the critic starts up, say, "Ah, there's the critic again." When the commander takes over, label it. This might feel strange at first, but it gives you distance. It reminds you, this is not all of me. This is just one voice in a room. The more distance you create, the more power you have. The voice in your head is not a fact machine. It's a habit machine. And like any habit, it can be unlearned and retrained. Imagine standing in front of a mirror. Would you ever point at your reflection and say, "You're pathetic. You always fail. You don't deserve this"? Probably not, but you've said it internally, many times. So, why does the reflection in your mind deserve less kindness than the reflection in the glass? Your inner voice is the most persuasive one you'll ever hear because it speaks your language. It knows your weaknesses, your past, your fears. But if you teach it to be a guide instead of a bully, it also becomes your greatest strength. Real persuasion doesn't begin with talking to others. It begins with how you talk to yourself when no one else is listening. Chapter 3. Think about the last time you made a bold move. Maybe it was small, saying no to something you usually say yes to. Or maybe it was big, starting something new, standing up for yourself, speaking your truth. Whatever it was, before the move, there was a moment, a hesitation, a breath. And in that moment, your inner voice had a chance to speak. What did it say? The voice we hear in those moments, the crossroads, the tension points, is often the voice that decides whether we move forward or retreat. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be convincing. And it almost always is, because it speaks in the language of your emotions. Your inner voice is not just about logic. It's emotional. It remembers how you felt when you failed before. It remembers the shame, the sting of criticism, the loneliness of rejection. And when a similar situation arises, it whispers warnings, not to be cruel, but to keep you safe. That's what most people don't realize. Your inner voice is often trying to protect you, but protection can be a trap if it's based on outdated fear. Imagine this. You're standing at the edge of a pool. You want to jump in, but your inner voice remembers that one time, long ago, when you jumped into a different pool and landed badly. Or maybe you didn't know how to swim then. Or maybe people laughed. So now your voice says don't jump, not because the water is bad, but because it remembers pain. That's the core issue. The inner voice doesn't always update itself. It responds to emotional memories, not the current reality. So many people live according to emotional history rather than present possibility. To persuade your inner voice, you have to help it update its map. Let's take a closer look at how emotional memory shapes our inner dialogue. Picture a child who tries something new, drawing, dancing, asking a question in class. If the response is encouraging, their inner voice might say, "That was fun. Try again." If the response is mocking, dismissive, or cold, the voice changes. "That was stupid. Don't do that again." And that sentence, spoken quietly once, repeats over years until it becomes a rule. Don't be creative. Don't be visible. Don't be wrong. This is how emotional scars become internal laws. But here's the liberating truth. Those laws are built on moments, not facts. They can be challenged, rewritten, replaced. The process begins when you pause and ask your inner voice 2 questions. Where did you learn that? Is that still true today? For example, if your voice says you're not leadership material, ask, where did I learn that? Maybe it was a moment in high school when a teacher ignored your ideas, or a time you got overlooked at work. Then ask, is that still true today? Maybe now you've grown, learned, taken responsibility. Maybe the only thing standing in your way is that voice stuck in the past. We don't question our inner voice enough. We assume it's giving us wisdom when it's often just recycling old warnings. The trick is to gently, persistently update that voice with new data. This doesn't mean replacing every doubt with empty positivity. It means adding nuance. Instead of, "I'll probably fail, try," "I might fail, but I'll learn faster that way." Instead of, People won't like this. Try. Some people won't, and that's okay. I'm not here for everyone. You're not trying to shout over your inner voice. You're teaching it to reason more usefully. That's what true persuasion is, not silencing doubt, but redirecting it. Because here's something powerful to understand. Your inner voice listens to you. It doesn't only talk. It absorbs what you repeat. It learns from your behavior. If every time you're afraid, you shrink, your inner voice says, fear means stop. But if every time you're afraid, you move anyway, even a little, it begins to learn. Fear means stretch. Fear means grow. You're training it with every action. The smallest choice, to speak up, to apply, to try, becomes part of the voice's memory bank. And over time, it starts to change. Your voice begins to say, we've done this before. We didn't die. Let's try again. That's how confidence is built. Confidence is not the absence of fear. It's the inner voice that says, you can handle this, even when fear is present. But this change doesn't happen passively. You must speak back to your inner voice. When it says you're not enough, you don't scream over it. You respond. You say, maybe I'm not perfect, but I've grown. I'm learning. I'm trying. This isn't delusion. It's a more accurate version of the truth. The voice that persuades you best doesn't pretend everything is easy. It reminds you that difficulty isn't disqualification. It says you can do hard things. It says even if you fail, you're still worthy. It says the goal is progress, not perfection. And the more you practice speaking to yourself this way, the more natural it becomes. You'll notice it when you hesitate, and the pause feels shorter. When you're afraid, and the voice says, let's go anyway. This is what we're building. An inner voice that moves you forward instead of pulling you back. Not with pressure, not with punishment, but with belief. Because here's the truth no one tells you early enough. The person you become depends, in large part, on whether your inner voice is working for you or against you. And that choice starts with one simple question. What do I want this voice to sound like 5 years from now? Now start speaking that way today. Chapter 4. There's a moment in every important conversation, especially the ones we have with ourselves, where silence creeps in. It's not a long pause, just a flicker, a beat, but it's in that beat that a decision begins to form. And in that decision, something powerful happens. You either surrender to the old voice or you invite a new one. We don't talk enough about how daily persuasion, the kind that really shapes a life, is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet or a lightning bolt. It shows up when your alarm rings and you're debating whether to get up or stay in bed. It's there when you check your phone instead of working on what matters. It's the voice that says, just one more scroll, or the one that says, start now. You'll feel better. Most of the time, persuasion isn't dramatic. It's invisible. It's the slow bending of your behavior in a direction, one whisper at a time. And that's why it's so important to become aware of the tone your inner voice uses. The tone is everything. If you would take your inner voice out of your head and let someone else hear it, would it sound like someone you respect? Someone you trust for advice? Or would it sound like a petty critic, a pushy boss, a tired parent? So often, we accept a tone internally that we never allow from someone else. You'd never let a friend speak to you the way you speak to yourself when you fail. You'd never tell someone you love you're pathetic or you're always messing up or everyone's better than you. But we say these things internally, and we say them so often that they start to sound normal. But normal isn't the same as true, and repetition doesn't make something wise. That's why the next step in building a persuasive inner voice is changing its tone. Let's imagine two coaches. Coach uses fear, yells when you mess up, highlights your weaknesses, demand perfection. You get results sometimes, but you dread practice. You shrink under pressure. Coach B uses firmness, but also empathy. points out what went wrong, but focuses on how to improve, reminds you why you started, builds you up when you feel down. You still get results, but you also build confidence, resilience, and trust, which coach gets more out of you long term. Now here's the question that really matters. Which one lives in your head? Most people have internalized a harsh coach. They think that's what gets results. But here's the truth. Harshness might get short-term obedience, but destroys long-term belief. If your inner voice constantly relies on guilt, shame, or self-criticism, eventually you stop listening, or worse, you start avoiding action just to avoid hearing it. But if your voice sounds like a trustworthy guide, someone who expects a lot from you, but also believes in you, you begin to show up. You begin to try. You begin to risk more. Because now, failure isn't identity. It's just feedback. Changing the tone of your inner voice doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means raising your respect for yourself. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with me?" try, "What can I learn from this?" Instead of, "I blew it," try, "That didn't work. What's the next step?" Instead of, "I'm so behind," try, "This is where I am. What would forward look like today?" You don't need to become a cheerleader. You just need to become a coach who builds trust instead of fear. This brings us to another important concept, rehearsal. We usually think of rehearsal in the context of performance, actors, musicians, speakers. But your inner voice is rehearsing all the time. It practices responses in advance. It anticipates criticism. It prepares for failure before success even arrives. Pay attention to what your voice rehearses. Does it rehearse rejection more than acceptance? Failure more than growth? Conflict more than resolution? Whatever you rehearse becomes your expectation, and your expectations shape your choices. If you rehearse disaster, you act defensively. If you rehearse embarrassment, you avoid visibility. But if you rehearse calm, clarity, growth, you begin to act with intention. So take 5 minutes a day, just 5, and rehearse something positive. Not fake optimism. Just visualizing yourself responding well to a challenge. Speaking calmly in a tense moment. Trying again after a setback. Being kind to yourself in the middle of a mistake. This small daily rehearsal teaches your inner voice what to say when the real moment comes. It's not magic. It's practice. You're not born with persuasive inner voice. You build it. You choose its tone. You give it language. You model how it responds to difficulty. And over time, it becomes your anchor, not your enemy. One final thought for this chapter. You will never be fully free from self-doubt. No one is. But what changes everything is who speaks next. Doubt might always be the first voice, but it doesn't have to be the last. Chapter 5. Every day, people walk into rooms where they feel they don't belong. They sit in meetings, step on stages, enter relationships, or face mirrors with silent question echoing inside. Am I enough? It's a question that rarely speaks out loud. It shows up as hesitation, as second guessing, as holding back a good idea, laughing at a bad joke, or saying yes when you mean no. The question doesn't need words. It lives in posture, tone, and energy. And most of the time it's fueled not by facts, but by an old narrative, the story your inner voice keeps telling you about who you are. If you ever felt like an imposter in your own life, you're not broken. You're just repeating a story that was never really yours to begin with. The story often starts in childhood. Maybe someone told you that you were too sensitive, or too loud, or too much. Maybe you learned that success belonged to other people. Smarter people, richer people, luckier people. Maybe you made a few mistakes early on and quietly decided, I'm not the kind of person who gets it right. And from there, your inner voice began to tell the story of you over and over, not as an objective narrator, but as a biased one, selectively remembering your worst moments, minimizing your wins, repeating the story until you believed it. This is where the inner voice becomes most powerful and most dangerous. It shapes not just how you see yourself, but what you think you're allowed to become. The good news? Stories can change. But to change the story, you first have to recognize it, and that takes honesty. Sit quietly for a moment and finish the sentence. The kind of person I am is, go ahead, no filters. Just listen to what comes up. I'm disorganized. I never follow through. I'm bad with people. I always mess things up. I'm not leadership material. I don't deserve love. I can't be trusted with money. Whatever you filled in, that's your inner script. Most of us think our inner dialogue is describing reality, but it's usually just repeating conclusions we drew from emotional events we never fully processed. So the first step is to separate fact from interpretation. Let's say your voice says, I'm bad with money. Ask, what event shaped that story? Maybe you struggle with debt in your 20s. Maybe you made one big financial mistake and still feel ashamed. But is that who you are, or just something you experienced? You are not your worst pattern, and you are not the story your fear keeps telling. Once you start seeing the gap between event and identity, you can rewrite the script. Instead of I'm bad with money, try it and learn financial skills early, but I'm learning now. Instead of I always quit, try I've stopped before, but I'm practicing consistency. The difference is subtle, but it's the difference between a prison sentence and a path forward. And here's a secret most people never realize. Your brain wants a story that makes sense. If your current life doesn't fit your old identity, your mind will either change the story or sabotage your progress to make it match again. That's why people backslide after a win. The inner voice says, this isn't like you. You don't finish things. You don't belong here. And slowly, you pull yourself back into alignment with the old narrative, unless you deliberately update it. So here's a small practical exercise. Choose one identity you want to grow into. Maybe it's, I am someone who speaks with confidence. I am a person who follows through. I am the kind of person who takes care of their body. I am a good friend. I am a thoughtful leader. Now, write down 3 pieces of evidence in the past month, no matter how small, that support this identity. Maybe you made one phone call you were scared of. Maybe you went for a walk instead of scrolling. Maybe you showed up on time, offered help, or just stayed calm in a tough conversation. These are not small things. They are micro-proof, and micro-proof matters. Because your inner voice doesn't need grand speeches. It just needs regular, believable reasons to trust you. Every time you act in alignment with the person you want to be, you're not faking it. You're training your voice to speak a new truth. And when the inner critic shows up, and it will, you don't silence it with noise. You meet it with facts, with memory, with small wins stacked like bricks into a foundation of identity. Over time, your voice stops saying, who do you think you are? And starts saying, this is who we are now. And that quiet shift, that's the moment you stop negotiating with doubt. Not because it disappeared, but because your belief finally spoke louder. Chapter 6. Most people imagine persuasion as a tool you use on others, a way to influence someone's decision, win them over, or get them to say yes. But what they miss is this. The most critical kind of persuasion isn't external. It's internal. You have to convince yourself before you can convince anyone else. This is where the idea of credibility comes in. You don't need to be perfect to persuade yourself, but you do need to be consistent. Your inner voice draws its strength from one thing above all, evidence. Every time you follow through on a commitment, your voice gets stronger. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, no matter how small, you prove to your subconscious that you are someone worth listening to. And the reverse is also true. Every time you say you'll start tomorrow and don't, every time you say just this once for the 10th time, every time you set a goal and abandon it without reflection, your inner voice loses credibility. It becomes noise, static, unreliable narration. Eventually, even when it says something good, "You've got this," you don't believe it, because too many false promises have broken the trust. Persuasion, like trust, is not built in one moment. It's built in thousands of small, private ones. This is why big declarations so often fail. You tell yourself, "I'll change everything tomorrow." You feel a spark of motivation, but without structure, without a trail of small wins, the voice that tries to encourage you feels hollow. It's not a lack of willpower, it's a lack of internal proof. So, how do you start rebuilding credibility with yourself? Start with agreements you can keep. Make your promises smaller, but non-negotiable. Instead of "I'll write for 2 hours every day," say "I'll write 1 sentence." Instead of "I'll stop procrastinating," say "I'll open a document and work for 5 minutes." Instead of "I'll fix my whole life," say "I'll drink a glass of water when I wake up." It sounds silly. It sounds too easy. But here's the truth. Small promises kept are worth more than big promises broken, because each one becomes a vote, a deposit in the account of inner trust. And the more votes you accumulate, the more persuasive your inner voice becomes. Eventually, you'll notice something subtle. The inner voice stops needing to beg. It doesn't have to shout "do it," because it knows you will. It doesn't panic when you get off track, because it trusts you'll come back. It doesn't need to convince you. You're already aligned. This is what real self-discipline feels like. Not harsh, but steady. Not dramatic, but dependable. It's not about having a steel will. It's about having a quiet agreement with yourself that you honor day after day. This brings us to another crucial part of inner persuasion: how you respond to broken promises. No one is perfect. You will slip. You will miss a day. You will break an agreement. The question is, what happens next? A weak inner voice spirals into guilt, shame, and all or nothing thinking. I blew it, so it doesn't matter anymore. A persuasive inner voice interrupts that spiral. It says, "That happened. Let's get back to it." Not as an excuse, but as a decision. And that's the real test of persuasion. Not how you talk to yourself when things go well, but how you talk to yourself when they don't. If you want to build a voice that leads you forward, train it to be both honest and hopeful. It should tell you the truth. You didn't follow through today. Without attacking your worth, you're a failure. It should remind you of your power, not your shame. This kind of voice becomes especially important when you're trying to make long-term change. Because real change takes longer than you think. There's a moment in every journey, often right after the beginning, where progress slows, motivation fades, and the novelty wears off. This is where most people quit, not because they're lazy, but because their inner voice hasn't been trained to lead them through the middle. That's why the most persuasive voices are the ones that can navigate boredom, discouragement, and repetition without losing sight of the goal. They remind you that it's working, even when it doesn't feel like it. They remind you that one bad day is not a verdict. They remind you that every step forward counts, even if it's small. Because in the end, persuasion is not about talking yourself into action. It's about becoming the kind of person who acts without needing to be talked into it. And that identity doesn't come from hype. It comes from habits. So the next time you hear your inner voice try and convince you to keep going, ask yourself, has it earned my trust? If not, don't silence it. Strengthen it. Start small. Stay honest. And most of all, keep your word, even when no one is watching. Especially then. Because that's how the quietest voice becomes the most powerful one you have. Chapter 7. There's a moment just before we make a decision, when everything gets quiet inside, a breath held, a pause. This is a space where your inner voice steps forward, not to shout, but to nudge. Some call it instinct, others call it intuition. But if you pay close attention, you'll notice something deeper. It's not just a feeling. It's a form of guidance shaped by experience, emotion, and subconscious understanding. This is the intelligent whisper, a voice that doesn't argue, doesn't panic, and doesn't always speak in words. You felt it before. It's the sense that a room is off, even if everyone is smiling. The urge to call someone you haven't spoken to in years. The resistance you feel when saying yes to something that doesn't sit right. The quiet pull toward a path that makes no logical sense, but feels right in your bones. We're trained to ignore that voice. We're taught to explain, analyze, and seek permission. We confuse rationality with wisdom. But sometimes, the deeper wisdom comes in silence, in stillness, in subtle signals from within. The intelligent whisper is not dramatic. It doesn't feed your ego or your fear. It doesn't push, it invites. And yet, many people can't hear it anymore. Why? Because their inner world is too loud. When your internal space is filled with noise, doubt, anxiety, overthinking, self-judgment, there's no room for the whisper to rise. Imagine trying to hear a single violin in the middle of a stadium packed with drums. The violin is still playing, but you can't hear it. Not because it's wrong, but because the environment doesn't allow it. This is why learning to hear yourself again is an act of discipline. It means stepping back from the urgency, turning down the volume on everyone else's opinions, choosing stillness over speed, space over noise. And the more you practice, the clearer the whisper becomes. One way to reconnect with it is to start paying attention to how your body responds in certain moments. Your body often hears the whisper before your mind does. Notice the tension in your shoulders when someone asks you for a favor you don't want to give. Notice the way your breathing changes when you walk into a room you're not comfortable in. Notice the calm you feel around certain people without needing to explain why. Your body is a messenger. Don't shoot it. Listen. The intelligent whisper also becomes louder with trust. The more you act on it, and things turn out well, the more you'll believe it. And even when you act on it and the result isn't perfect, you often find that you were still right to listen, because maybe you avoided something worse, or learned something you couldn't have learned another way. Sometimes the point of listening isn't the result. It's the alignment. When your actions and your internal compass match, you feel strong. Oh, even if the world around you doesn't understand. Of course, not every quiet voice is the right one. Fear can also whisper. So can avoidance. So how do you tell the difference? The intelligent whisper comes with clarity, not confusion. It feels calm, not panicked. It's quiet but firm. It doesn't need a reason. It is the reason. Fear says, don't do it, you'll fail. The whisper says, this isn't right for you. Fear screams. The whisper informs. Fear shrinks. The whisper protects. Fear is reactive. The whisper is reflective. To learn the difference, ask yourself, does this voice make me smaller or stronger? Does it help me hide or help me align? And then trust your answer. The most persuasive people you'll ever meet, the ones who carry themselves with calm certainty, aren't usually the loudest or the most charismatic. They're the ones who've learned to hear and trust their intelligent whisper. They act from alignment, not approval. They don't rush decisions just because the world is impatient. They don't betray their values just to make people comfortable. They don't chase everything that sparkles. They wait for what shines from within. And here's the best part. You have this voice too. You've had it since the beginning. You were born with it. Somewhere along the way, it got buried under noise, fear, and conditioning, but it's still there waiting. The question is no longer, do you have an inner voice that can guide you? The real question is, will you make space for it to speak? And when it does, will you listen, not with your ears, but with your whole life? Chapter 8. If there's one habit that quietly poisons your inner voice, it's self-interruption. You know the pattern. You start something meaningful, a project, a conversation, a quiet moment of reflection, and just as something real begins to unfold, a notification dings. A doubt creeps in, a distraction wins, and you stop, not because you wanted to, but because part of you is trained to abandon yourself the moment things get uncomfortable or uncertain. This constant interruption chips away at the most essential condition for a persuasive inner voice: continuity. You cannot build a compelling voice inside yourself if you constantly pull the rug out from under it. Every time you check out before a thought finishes forming or switch tasks before a moment fully lands, you weaken the connection between intention and attention. Your inner voice doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be heard, and hearing it takes time, focus, space. This is why stillness, though often underestimated, is one of the greatest tools for persuasion. Stillness is not the absence of action. It's the full presence of attention. When you give yourself even 5 minutes of true attention, undistracted, uninterrupted, you begin to notice the signals beneath the surface. You give your inner voice a chance to complete its sentence. It's in stillness that vague emotions become specific, that hunches reveal their reasons, that worries, when fully heard, often dissolve instead of grow. The problem is, we've been trained to fear that silence, to fill every gap with stimulation. We don't pause to listen, we scroll. We don't sit with a question, we Google. We don't lean into discomfort, we escape. But the voice that persuades, the one that makes you act, move, create, change, it lives in a space that most people rush past. Learning to sit in stillness is not about meditation or mindfulness techniques, though those help. It's about respect. Respect for your own experience. Respect for your own thoughts. Respect for the process that happens when you stop interrupting yourself. Think of someone you admire. Chances are they have one thing in common: a groundedness, a presence, a sense that they are not rushed by the world, but anchored in themselves. This isn't something they were born with. It's something they practiced. And part of that practice is knowing how to listen longer than is comfortable. Here's a truth most people don't talk about. Clarity doesn't usually arrive in the first minute. Sometimes it shows up in the 6th, or the 26th, or the day after you gave up and went to sleep. But it does come if you stay with it. The inner voice that persuades doesn't deliver answers on demand. It rewards those who return. Another way we interrupt ourselves is through premature judgment. You get an idea and immediately doubt it. You feel a desire and instantly label it as selfish or unrealistic. You imagine a path and shut it down before it has a chance to breathe. This kind of interruption is subtle but deadly. If your inner voice learns that every time it speaks, it will be mocked, silenced, or ignored, it eventually stops speaking altogether. Not because it has nothing to say, but because it knows you won't listen. So what does it look like to build an inner world that encourages speech instead of silence? It looks like giving your ideas room to be bad before they're good. It looks like letting your doubts speak without giving them the final vote. It looks like treating your mind like a trusted companion, not a courtroom. This isn't indulgent. It's necessary. You can't think clearly if you're also dodging internal attacks. You can't persuade yourself to act if your first instinct is to criticize every impulse. You need a space, at least one, where your thoughts are safe to unfold. This doesn't mean you follow every idea, but you hear them first. You let them come to completion before you decide what to do with them. Because often, what begins as a foolish thought matures into an important realization if you don't cut it off too early. The quiet inner voice that persuades you to do hard things, to face truth, to take risks. It is not dramatic. It doesn't fight for airtime. But if you keep interrupting it, it simply leaves. And then you are left with the voices that are always loud. Fear, noise, opinion, urgency. To reclaim your own voice, you must become patient again. Patient enough to finish a paragraph. Patient enough to sit in silence. patient enough to let a thought evolve. It's not easy in a world that runs on interruptions, but it's possible, and it's powerful. Because once your inner voice knows it has space, it begins to speak more clearly. It becomes companion again, a navigator, a calm, persuasive presence guiding you, not with pressure, but with wisdom. The irony is, most people are searching for direction in 1,000 different places, but the most compelling direction is the one you carry with you. If you'd only stop long enough to listen. Chapter 9. When people think of persuasion, they often picture influence over others, words that move crowds, speeches that change minds. But perhaps the deepest, most lasting persuasion isn't outward, it's inward, to persuade yourself. This may sound odd. Why would you need to persuade yourself? Aren't you the one in control? Not exactly. The truth is, there are many cells inside you. There's a self that wants to grow, and the one that fears change. There's a self that dreams boldly, and the one that whispers, play it safe. There's a self that acts from purpose, and the one that seeks comfort no matter the cost. Every meaningful decision you make is the result of a quiet vote inside, and often the battle isn't between right and wrong. It's between courage and convenience, between your higher aim and your current appetite. The inner voice that persuades is the one that unites these selves, not by force, but by invitation, by reasoning with the fearful part, by encouraging the doubtful part, by calming the impulsive part, until all of you is ready to move in the same direction. This is not easy. In fact, it might be the hardest kind of persuasion there is, because it requires truth. You can't persuade yourself with lies. You might be able to trick others, pretend for a while, perform strength, but inside, you know when you're off track. You know when you're making excuses. You know when you're shrinking. So real self-persuasion begins with honesty. To sit with yourself and say, this is what I truly want. This is what I'm afraid of. This is where I'm sabotaging. And this is where I'm going. The voice that persuades begins from this honesty, not shame. It's not there to punish you. It's there to guide you. It says, yes, you messed up before, but you're still capable. It says, this is hard, but you're built for hard things. It says, you don't need permission to begin. It's not about positive affirmations plastered over doubt. It's about walking into the doubt, talking to it, and reminding it of what matters most. This kind of persuasion is gentle but firm. It's not pushy, it's persistent. It helps you get out of bed when you'd rather give up. It helps you make the call you've been dreading. It helps you walk back into the gym, the studio, the page, even after failing. You could call this resilience, or self-discipline, or internal leadership. But at its core, it's persuasion, the art of moving yourself toward what matters. Sometimes this persuasion looks like tough love. Sometimes it looks like radical patience. Sometimes it's a whisper, one more step. Other times it's a roar, now. The voice shifts depending on what you need, but it always speaks with care. It always holds your future in mind. To strengthen this voice, start by noticing when the wrong voice is winning. You'll know it by the patterns it creates. When you find yourself justifying actions you know you'll regret, when you keep setting goals you don't believe in, when you feel like you're watching yourself from the outside, detached from your own life, that's when your inner voice has been overpowered by noise, by fear, by fatigue, by outside expectations. Don't shame yourself. Just pause, listen, then ask, what do I really want right now, not just in this moment, but in the long run? That question alone can reignite the real voice inside you. And then talk back to the fear, not to silence it, but to reason with it. Say, yes, this is scary, but staying stuck is scarier. Say, yes, I failed before, but I've also survived before. Say, yes, this is hard, but what if it's also worth it? You don't have to be perfect to persuade yourself. You just have to be honest and consistent. Each time you do what your higher self wants, even in a small way, you strengthen that inner voice. Each time you follow through instead of flaking, each time you speak your truth instead of hiding, each time you sit with discomfort instead of escaping, you're casting a vote for the version of you that leads, not the one that hides. Over time, those votes add up. The persuasive voice becomes louder, steadier, more trusted. And eventually, you stop needing to fight yourself every step of the way. You become aligned, not flawless, not fearless, but integrated. That's when real momentum begins. Not because life got easier, but because you stop arguing with yourself long enough to move forward. That is a quiet power of inner persuasion. Chapter 10. By now, you walk through a journey most people never realize they need to take. The journey inward, toward a voice that isn't loud or showy. A voice that doesn't chase attention or demand applause, but a voice that guides, that steadies, that persuades. This inner voice, if you've begun to hear it, isn't new. It's always been there, softly speaking through your instincts, your questions, your longings. But life has a way of covering it up, with noise, with urgency, with shame, with the voices of others who convince you there's mattered more. You don't need to become someone else to access this voice. You don't need a title, a platform, or a plan. You simply need space, and honesty, and a little courage, because this voice won't shout to get your attention. It waits for your invitation. And once it's allowed in, it becomes your most loyal ally. It tells you when you're drifting. It reminds you of your principles. It calls you back when you start shrinking to fit into someone else's idea of success. And perhaps most importantly, it persuades you to act when everything in you wants to hide. This is the voice that whispers, you can do this. Not because it's easy, but because it's yours to do. It's the voice that doesn't let fear have the final word. It's the voice that knows the real cost of avoidance and the quiet reward of showing up. The power of this voice is not in what it says once, but in how consistently it shows up when you let it. It doesn't disappear when things go wrong. It doesn't abandon you in failure. In fact, it often grows strongest in those moments when all other voices are silent or cruel. In those moments, it says, try again, begin anyway, stay with it. You're not done yet. We live in a world filled with external persuasion, ads, influencers, noise. It's easy to believe that change only happens out there through force or flash or strategy. But real change, lasting change begins here, inside you, one thought at a time, one choice at a time. You may never become the loudest voice in the room. That's okay. You don't need to convince everyone. You just need to convince the person you wake up with every morning, the one you carry into every meeting, every mirror, every moment of doubt. That person is listening. So speak. Speak with clarity. Speak with patience. Speak with respect. And most of all, speak with love, not fluff, but the kind of love that tells the truth, that calls you higher, that doesn't flinch when the work is hard. The inner voice that persuades is not a miracle. It's a muscle. You build it by using it, by listening when it's inconvenient, by speaking when you feel unsure, by following it, even when the path isn't paved with certainty. The more you return to it, the more it returns to you. And over time, it becomes the most trusted sound in your life. Not because it always has the answers, but because it helps you ask the right questions. Not because it removes all fear, but because it helps you act anyway. Not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. So let this be your quiet revolution. To live guided, to live true, to let your deepest voice be not just heard, but followed. Because when you follow the voice that persuades from within, you don't just change your path, you change who you become.